When you think about the profitable American businesses of the 1950s and early 1960s, your mind probably goes to the obvious places: department stores, automobile manufacturers, oil companies operating at the continental scale. But there's a business that made extraordinary money during this era, a business so ordinary that it's nearly invisible in our historical memory, a business that required almost no technological innovation, minimal marketing, and operated on the thinnest margins imaginable. Yet owners of this business were driving Cadillacs and buying second homes. That business was the independent gas station. Not the oil major brands, not Shell or Standard Oil or Texaco operating massive refineries, but the single operator, the man or woman who owned one corner property in a small town or a highway stretch, who pumped gasoline, cleaned windshields, and collected cash from sunrise to midnight. And here's what catches people off guard. These stations made their real money in a place most people never think about. Not from gasoline, not from oil changes, from something else entirely, something that transformed the economics of the entire operation. To understand the hidden machinery of the independent gas station, we need to step back and recognize something about the American economy in 1962. Gasoline was cheap, catastrophically cheap by today's standards. In inflation-adjusted dollars, premium gasoline cost roughly what regular unleaded costs now. A gallon of regular sold for about 32 cents. A station owner might purchase that gallon from a distributor for 28 cents. That's a 4-cent gross margin per gallon. A 4-cent profit on every single gallon they moved. Think about that. On a busy day selling 400 gallons of gasoline, and that was considered busy for a country station, the station owner made $16 gross from fuel sales. After paying an attendant to pump and wash windows, the profit was nearly invisible. The economics were brutal. Yet these stations proliferated. There were over 140,000 independent gas stations in America by 1960. They weren't failing. Many were thriving. Where did the money come from? The answer sits in those glass cases behind the counter. The accessories, the supplies, the convenience items. A station owner bought quart cans of motor oil from a distributor for perhaps 40 cents per can. They sold them for 85 cents. That's a 90% markup. A tube of grease cost 30 cents wholesale, sold for 65 cents. A can of solvent cost 20 cents wholesale, sold for 45 cents. Spark plugs, air filters, wiper blades, headlight bulbs, radiator hose clamps, every single one of these items carried margins that would make a modern convenience store owner weep with envy. But here's what makes the financial picture even more interesting. These items didn't sit on shelves collecting dust. Drivers stopped for gasoline and bought them out of genuine necessity. An engine burning oil in 1962 meant you stopped every other day to top up a quart. Spark plugs fouled regularly and needed replacement. Headlights burned out. Radiators leaked. The American car in 1962 was fundamentally less reliable than the modern vehicle, which means drivers had genuine reasons to visit the parts counter. And they had nowhere else to go. The independent gas station occupied a unique position in the distribution network of rural and suburban America. If you were driving on a highway in Indiana in 1962 and your car started overheating, you didn't go shopping around, you stopped at the next station. If you were in a small town 30 miles from the nearest city and your oil light came on, you bought from the local station. There was no competition. The station owner wasn't competing with Amazon or Walmart. They barely competed with other stations because distribution meant that stations were often the only source of these items within miles. This created what economists call a captive market. Drivers were psychologically and practically dependent on the station for these emergency supplies. A station owner could therefore charge significantly more than the wholesale cost, not in a gouging sense, but in a completely legitimate markup that reflected the value of immediate availability. Consider the financial model of a successful independent station in 1962. Let's use a real example. A station in a county seat town of about 8,000 people, open 6 days a week, with one owner and one full-time attendant. Daily gasoline sales, 300 gallons at a 4-cent gross margin equals $12. Monthly gasoline revenue, roughly $360. This is the obvious income stream, and on its face it barely covers the attendant's wages. But oil sales tell a different story. In a town of 8,000 with 3,000 vehicles registered locally, if even a fraction of those vehicles needed a quart of oil per month, and many did, the station might sell 30 quarts per week. 30 quarts per week at a 45-cent margin equals $13.50 per week. That's $54 per month from oil alone. Add in grease, air filters, spark plugs, headlight bulbs, and the station was generating perhaps $120 to $150 per month in accessory sales. Suddenly, the gross income from the counter items actually exceeded the gasoline income. More importantly, those items had almost zero inventory carrying cost. Motor oil didn't spoil, spark plugs didn't go bad. The station owner could stock them in cardboard boxes behind the counter and sell them months later with no loss. There was no refrigeration cost, no waste, no shrinkage, just pure margin. But the financial picture goes even deeper. Station owners quickly realized that the station itself could function as a social hub in small towns. They installed chairs, they brewed coffee, they stocked soft drinks in a cooler, purchased wholesale at perhaps 10 cents per bottle, sold at 20 cents. Drivers would stop to buy gas, chat about local news, and grab a Coca-Cola while they waited. That coffee and soft drink operation, while seemingly trivial, generated another $30 to $40 per month with nearly 80% gross margins. Some station owners went further. They installed restrooms, which required maintenance costs, but were a necessity that kept people stopping at their station instead of competitors. They sponsored local Little League teams, advertising their names on uniforms, gaining local loyalty that translated into customer habit. They offered credit to local farmers and mechanics, extending lines of credit that cost them nothing but created customer loyalty that was nearly unbreakable. The true genius of the independent gas station operation was that the owner had transformed what could have been a purely transactional business, I need gas, I pay you, I leave, into something far more economically resilient. The station became a place where people bought necessity items they couldn't get elsewhere, drank beverages at premium margins, used facilities that kept them coming back, and made purchasing decisions based on habit and personal relationships rather than price. The income statements of a successful independent station in a decent town location looked roughly like this. Gasoline sales at $360 monthly generated approximately $12 to $15 in gross profit after purchase cost. Counter sales and accessories generated $120 to $150 in gross margin. Beverages, candy, and incidentals added another $30 to $50. Total monthly gross margin before labor and rent sat somewhere around $200. The station owner paid one attendant perhaps $100 per month, a reasonable wage for 1962 labor. Rent on the property might be $30 to $50. Utilities, insurance, and maintenance perhaps another $30. That left the owner with roughly $70 to $80 of monthly profit on their own labor plus ownership. On an annual basis, that was between $800 and $1,000 in profit, all while the owner worked the station 6 days a week, pumping gas, collecting money, and maintaining relationships with local customers. In 1962, $1,000 per year represented a genuinely comfortable middle-class existence, especially in a small town where cost of living was substantially lower than in cities. A home could be purchased for $3,000 to $5,000. A new car cost around $2,000. The station owner was working hard, but they owned equity in a piece of property, controlled their own hours, and existed comfortably within the local economic hierarchy. Many station owners also owned the property their station sat on, purchased for $5,000 to $10,000 in the 1950s and paid down over years, which meant they were building equity while operating the business. This economic model remained viable as long as several conditions held true. First, gasoline had to remain cheap and relatively fungible. Customers couldn't easily shop around for better prices on fuel because there was nowhere else to shop. Second, cars had to remain mechanically unreliable enough that drivers needed frequent stops for emergency supplies. Third, there had to be no alternative distribution channels for automotive supplies. No mail order, no discount chains, no self-service anything. By the early 1970s, precisely these conditions began to shift. Discount chains started opening, offering motor oil and spark plugs at prices below what station owners could purchase them for wholesale. Highway systems were completed, making it unnecessary to stop in small towns. Cars became more reliable, requiring fewer emergency repairs. And most critically, self-service stations emerged. Stations where customers pumped their own gas, and margins on fuel collapsed even further. The independent gas station owner of 1962 was profiting from something that resembled a monopoly, not a legal monopoly, but a practical one born of geography, infrastructure, and the limitations of the distribution system. They occupied a position of scarcity, and that position was extraordinarily valuable. What's particularly striking about this financial model is that it reveals something most historical accounts miss about American small-town economics in the mid-20th century. We tend to romanticize this era as a time of small business ownership and entrepreneurship. In many ways, it was. But the profitability of these businesses depended entirely on structural limitations that modern economies have deliberately dismantled. Geography creating natural monopolies, information asymmetry keeping customers from knowing prices elsewhere, and underdeveloped distribution networks making the physical location of a business a decisive competitive advantage. The station owner of 1962 wasn't building a business on innovation or superior service or competitive advantages that could be replicated. They were profiting from the simple fact that their customer couldn't easily go anywhere else. Modern business tends to celebrate entrepreneurs who solve problems or create value. But the independent gas station owner was profiting primarily from insoluble geography and limited alternatives. Understanding this distinction is crucial to understanding not just the gas station, but the entire economic architecture of mid-century American small towns. There were other businesses that operated on similar principles. The rural hardware store operated on nearly identical economics. The owner purchased items wholesale at significant discounts but could charge customers markups that would seem excessive by modern standards because the customer had no alternative. Farmers needed fence wire, nails, tools, and seeds at specific times, and the local hardware store was the only source. The store owner therefore controlled pricing within wide ranges. The feed mill, the fertilizer distributor, the automotive parts supplier to mechanics. These businesses all operated within similar economic parameters. Geography created natural territorial monopolies. Limited transportation meant customers couldn't easily travel to competitors. Underdeveloped information systems meant prices weren't transparent, and the businesses that thrived were those that understood they were profiting not from competitive advantage, but from structural scarcity. This model had profound implications for the appearance and operation of these businesses. Station owners didn't need to invest heavily in the physical plant. They didn't need gleaming showrooms or polished service. They didn't need to advertise extensively or train staff extensively, or worry much about customer satisfaction in a modern sense. A reasonably friendly attendant, clean restrooms, and reliable pumps were sufficient. The customer would return because they had to, not because the experience was exceptional. The independent gas station was therefore a low-investment, low-overhead operation that generated consistent cash from a captive market. The barrier to entry was relatively low, a property, some pumps, and a small capital investment. But the barrier to competition was high because it required securing land in a good location, and that was difficult and expensive. Once established, the station generated reliable cash returns as long as the underlying conditions persisted. For the owner, it was an extraordinarily comfortable business to operate. You worked the station yourself much of the time, employed one or two local people, knew your customers by name, and made a solid living while building equity in real estate. There was little stress compared to more competitive businesses. You couldn't underprice your competitors because the geographic separation meant you barely had competitors. You couldn't lose customers to superior service at a distance because the customers couldn't reach distance. You existed in a protected economic space. The financial records that survive from independent station operators of this era reveal something interesting. Very few of them were obsessed with growth or market expansion. There was no notion of franchising or multiplying locations. Station owners thought like shopkeepers and small landowners, not entrepreneurs seeking to build empires. Their goal was to generate a comfortable local income, maintain their position within the community, and eventually pass the property to the next generation. This mindset reflects the underlying economic reality. Because the station's profitability depended entirely on location and geography, there was no scalable competitive advantage to export elsewhere. A successful station in one town couldn't franchise that success to other towns. Each location required its own careful analysis of local vehicle population, traffic patterns, and competitive presence. The business was fundamentally local, which meant growth strategies that worked in other industries made no sense here. The shift that destroyed this model came gradually but then suddenly. Through the 1960s, the American transportation network was revolutionized. Interstate highways connected small towns to distant competitors. Automobiles became more reliable. Commercial truck distribution networks developed to the point where even small towns could receive weekly deliveries of automotive supplies. Discount chains like Auto Shack and Pep Boys opened, offering spark plugs and motor oil at prices so competitive that station owners couldn't stock them profitably anymore. The most devastating change was the rise of self-service gasoline. By the late 1970s, self-service stations, operated by minimal staff and owned often by oil companies themselves, offered gasoline at prices that independent operators couldn't match. The margin squeeze on fuel became so severe that it was no longer economically viable to operate a small station and employ attendants. Within a decade, the economic model had inverted. The gas station could no longer be a full-service operation staffed by an owner and an attendant. Profitability shifted further toward convenience store sales, which required much more sophisticated supply chain management and competitive buying than a small operator could manage, and away from the core fuel business entirely. The station owner of 1962, who made money primarily by selling 30 quarts of motor oil per month to local drivers, had been economically displaced by a new class of station owner who made money by operating as a convenience store that happened to also sell gasoline. The transition was remarkably swift from an economic perspective. In 1970, the independent operator was still viable. By 1980, they were an anachronism. The structural conditions that had made the business profitable, geographic isolation, limited alternatives, underdeveloped distribution networks, customer automobile unreliability, had been eliminated by progress. The gas station business had been transformed from one based on location scarcity and necessity into one based on volume, efficiency, and vertical integration. What makes this transition historically important is that it reveals something true about the entire American small-town economy of the mid-20th century. The prosperity and stability of small-town business ownership depended heavily on structural protections, geographic isolation, limited information, limited transportation, and underdeveloped competition. When those protections were removed, the businesses didn't simply become less profitable. Many ceased to exist entirely. The independent station owner of 1962 was not facing a competitor who was simply smarter or more innovative. They were facing the systematic dismantling of the geographic and informational advantages that had protected their business. The modern transportation network, telecommunications, and commercial distribution systems were fundamentally incompatible with the small location, owner-operated gas station business model. There was nothing the owner could have done differently to adapt. The business form itself was becoming obsolete. This pattern repeated across multiple small-town businesses during the 1970s and 1980s. The rural hardware store faced the arrival of Home Depot. The local pharmacy faced the arrival of chain drugstores operating at mass scale. The small-town newspaper faced the consolidation of advertising into larger regional publications. The feed mill faced the consolidation of agricultural supply chains. In each case, what had been a comfortable, protected small business was exposed to competition and efficiency standards that it couldn't meet. The station owners who survived the transition were those who saw it coming early and either converted to convenience store operations, struck deals with oil companies to remain branded operators, or simply sold their property at a good price while it still had value. Those who tried to maintain the old model, continuing to focus on automotive supplies, retaining staff, maintaining the community gathering place function, found themselves unable to compete with the lower prices and broader selection of newly arriving competitors. By the 1990s, the truly independent operator, the person who owned a property, operated a station themselves, and employed a small number of local staff, had largely vanished from the American landscape. The remaining stations were either corporate-owned and operated, franchises of major brands, or integrated into convenience store chains. The owner-operator era was over. If you want to understand not just the financial mechanics of the gas station business, but the deeper story of how American small-town prosperity was constructed and then dismantled, it requires looking beyond the simple numbers. It requires understanding that the profit margins and income levels that seem so modest by modern standards were actually quite comfortable, because they were protected by geographic and structural advantages that are no longer present. The station owner of 1962 was, in a sense, a monopolist, not by legal designation but by circumstance. They operated in a protected market, they faced no meaningful price competition, their customers had no realistic alternative. This was the nature of American small-town business at that moment in history. The comfort and stability of that position was real, but it was built on a foundation that technology and infrastructure were already beginning to erode. Understanding the hidden economics of the gas station business, where the real money came from, what structural advantages protected it, and why those advantages couldn't be sustained, gives us a lens through which to understand the broader story of American economic change in the late 20th century. It wasn't simply that some businesses failed and others succeeded, it was that an entire class of protected, locally based small businesses found themselves suddenly exposed to competition they had no tools to manage. The transition was swift, impersonal, and economically devastating for those who hadn't prepared. The station owner, who understood that 70% of their profit came from motor oil and automotive supplies, and who then saw those same supplies available at half the price through mail order or in discount stores, was not facing an individual competitor. They were facing the collapse of the informational asymmetry and geographic scarcity that had protected their entire business model. By the time they recognized what was happening, their competitive position was already gone. This is the story that the simple financial metrics alone don't tell. Yes, the gas station made money. Yes, the margins on accessories were excellent. Yes, the owner was profitable and comfortable. But all of this rested on a particular moment in American economic history, a moment when geographic isolation and transportation limitations created protected markets where small operators could charge prices that reflected scarcity rather than competitive supply. Once that moment passed, the business as it had been known couldn't survive. The true cost of progress, then, wasn't just that the gas station business became less profitable. It was that an entire way of small-town business ownership and community economic life became structurally impossible. The progress itself, better transportation, better information, better distribution, was real and positive. But for the people whose livelihoods depended on the old scarcities, it was transformative in ways that weren't always positive. Understanding the hidden financial mechanics of the gas station business means understanding this transition and what it meant for American small towns and their relationship to their own economic futures. But there's another layer to this story, one that most people who lived through this era remember, even if they've never calculated its true cost. It's the question of what happened to the attendants themselves, the men and women who worked those pumps day after day. Because the economics of the gas station weren't just about the owner's profit margin. They were about labor costs, staffing models, and a particular kind of employment relationship that was only sustainable within that same protected market structure. In the 1960s, a typical small-town gas station with 3 or 4 pumps would employ between 2 and 4 full-time staff members, plus occasional part-time help on weekends. The owner might work the pumps themselves during peak hours, but as the station matured, labor became one of the largest operating expenses, often running between 18 and 24% of total revenue, depending on local wage rates and how much work was required for maintenance and repairs. Consider a station generating $8,500 in annual revenue, a solid operation in a town of 5.00 to 8.00 people. 2 full-time attendants might each earn $6,500 to $7,500 per year, plus the owner's own draw of perhaps $1.2.00 to $1.5. That's roughly $2.0.000 to $2.2.00 in direct labor costs per year before any payroll taxes. Add in the employer's share of Social Security, about 3%, and you're looking at $2.0.600 to $2.2.700 in total labor expense. At an $8.5.00 revenue station, that represents about 24% of gross income. But here's what's crucial to understanding why this employment model eventually collapsed. Those wage rates were sustainable only because the attendants had virtually nowhere else to work. In a small town of 5.00 people, there might be a bank, a hardware store, the local school, perhaps a manufacturing plant or grain elevator. The gas station wasn't unique as an employment opportunity, but it was one of only a handful of places that would hire someone without a high school diploma or specialized training, teach them a skill that could translate to other work, and provide stable, year-round employment. This was the hidden contract of small-town gas station employment: modest wages but stability, community recognition, and the chance to develop real technical knowledge about engines and automobiles. Many of those attendants eventually became the mechanics or service station owners themselves. It was a ladder within the system. But when highways displaced those stations, when self-service became the norm, and when larger regional operators began consolidating the market, that employment pathway collapsed too. The skill of being a full-service gas station attendant, pumping gas, checking tire pressure, topping up radiators, knowing the regulars by name, became economically obsolete. And the stations that survived the transition were the ones that moved towards self-service, which meant they needed perhaps 1 attendant instead of 2 or 3, and that attendant was now supervising pumps rather than performing service. The wage pressure was immediate. By the early 1970s, self-service attendant positions in small towns were paying $5 to $6.500 per year, less in real terms than they had 10 years earlier, with fewer hours and no clear path to advancement. The job was becoming what it would remain: an entry-level position for high school students, not a permanent career with dignity and economic stability. This shift had consequences that rippled through small-town economies in ways that weren't captured in any gas station owner's profit and loss statement. When permanent full-time employment at the station became part-time work for teenagers, the station ceased being a wealth-building pathway for adults. The men who had once been able to support a family of 4 on a gas station attendant's wage couldn't do so anymore. And the young people working those positions found no career ladder leading anywhere. So the question becomes, how much of the efficiency of modern gas station economics, the lower margins, the higher volume, the rapid turnover, is actually efficiency, and how much of it is simply the elimination of good jobs that once existed? The station that now operates with one part-time attendant handling $2.00.000 in annual volume is more profitable on paper than the station that operated with 3 full-time attendants handling $8.5.000 in annual volume. But the economic value that was created in the second scenario, the stable employment, the skill development, the pathway to ownership, that value disappeared. This is a pattern that appears across nearly every sector we examine on this channel. The elimination of labor-intensive small businesses isn't neutral from an economic standpoint. It's a redistribution of economic value from dispersed local operators and their employees toward consolidated regional and national operators. Whether that redistribution was necessary, inevitable, or the result of particular policy choices, that's a different question, and different people would answer it differently. But the reality is that it happened, and understanding it requires looking at the ledgers of not just the business owner, but the people whose livelihoods depended on the business existing in its original form. There's one more dimension to this that deserves attention: the question of capital formation in small towns. When someone in a town of 5,000 was able to save money from operating a modestly profitable gas station, perhaps accumulating $8 to $1.5,000 over a 5-year period, that capital often stayed local. It was reinvested in a home addition, put into a child's education, or loaned to a relative starting a business. The gas station wasn't just a retail business. It was part of the mechanism by which small-town residents accumulated capital and built intergenerational wealth. Once the station business became structurally unprofitable for small operators, that capital formation mechanism ceased. Young men who would have once owned a station and generated enough profit to fund the down payment on a home 5 years later now had no such pathway available. The economic ladder that had once been accessible to people without significant initial capital or advanced education was dismantled. And because that dismantling was gradual, happening over decades, from the 1960s through the 1980s, it rarely registered as a major historical event. The complete financial picture of what happened to the small-town gas station requires zooming out far enough to see all of these elements simultaneously: the economics of the business itself, the structure of the market, the nature of employment within that market, and the role of that employment in local capital formation and wealth building. It's a picture that most business histories miss, because they focus narrowly on the owner's story. But the owner's story only makes sense in the context of the entire system. If you want to understand the story in greater depth with actual case studies of specific stations, ledger analysis, wage records, and the complete timeline of how consolidation happened in different regions, that detailed breakdown is available in our complete guide, which you can find in the description or the pinned comment. I'll also be exploring other industries that experienced similar transformations, where good employment and local capital formation were quietly dismantled over decades. The gas station story isn't unique. It's one instance of a much larger pattern in American economic history: the slow replacement of small, locally owned, labor-intensive businesses with larger, regionally or nationally consolidated, capital-intensive operations. The replacement usually comes with higher efficiency, lower prices for consumers, and better returns for investors. But it also comes with the loss of stable employment pathways, the consolidation of wealth away from local communities, and the elimination of the kind of modest but achievable economic opportunity that once allowed someone without significant advantages to build a life. Understanding this requires the kind of close financial analysis that most business journalists and historians don't undertake. It's easier to talk about the rise of Walmart than to examine the detailed ledgers of the family stores it displaced. It's easier to celebrate the convenience of self-service gas stations than to track the wage records of the attendants who lost full-time employment. But if you want to truly understand American economic history, not just the broad strokes, but the way that ordinary people experience the transformation of their livelihoods and opportunities, you have to be willing to read the ledgers, analyze the numbers, and follow the data backward to the human reality it represents. This is precisely why understanding the financial mechanics of these vanished institutions matters so deeply. It's not nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It's not romanticizing a past that was, in many ways, more difficult and less equitable than today. It's about understanding the actual machinery of how American economic life worked. The real wages, the real margins, the real constraints that shaped what was possible and what was not. When we understand that a small-town hardware store operated on margins between 18 and 22%, we understand why those stores couldn't compete with big-box retailers. When we understand that a local newspaper's revenue was almost entirely dependent on subscription fees and local advertising, with no way to scale that revenue beyond the town's population, we understand why digital competition was so economically devastating. When we understand that a gas station attendant's paycheck depended on the station owner's ability to manage inventory turnover on fuel margins that were sometimes razor-thin, we understand why full-service gas stations couldn't survive the moment self-service became socially acceptable. These economic stories are stories about constraint and adaptation. They're about real people making decisions within the boundaries of the possible, and those boundaries were set not by individual virtue or failure, but by the underlying cost structures of their industries. A family that had run a department store for 3 generations couldn't simply innovate their way past Walmart's economies of scale. A newspaper publisher couldn't match the ad rates of a national media company. A gas station owner couldn't fight the economic logic of self-service fuel sales if their competitors had already adopted it. Understanding this doesn't excuse every decision made by those who displaced these businesses, but it does require us to approach the history of American capitalism with more nuance and more respect for the actual people involved. The story isn't that old businesses were lazy or incompetent or that new businesses were brilliant and unstoppable. The story is that economic structures changed, often gradually, sometimes suddenly, and those changes had winners and losers, beneficiaries and those who bore the cost. The reason I focus on this kind of detailed financial analysis is because it's the only way to truly understand what happened. It's the only way to move beyond surface narratives and see the real mechanics of American economic life. You can read 100 articles about the decline of American retail, but until you understand that department stores operated with inventory turnover rates of 2 to 3 times per year, and modern big box retailers operate at 6 to 8 times per year, you don't really understand what made the old model unsustainable. You can read about the rise of franchise restaurants, but until you understand that a locally owned diner needed to generate $8.00 to $1.200 in daily revenue just to break even, while a franchise operation could achieve profitability at $6.00 per day because of centralized purchasing, you're missing the economic core of the story. This level of granular analysis is what separates understanding American business history from simply consuming stories about it, and it's what I'm committed to exploring on this channel. Not the broad narratives everyone already knows, but the specific, detailed financial mechanics that made these institutions work, and the precise economic forces that changed everything. If you want to go much deeper into any of these financial stories, whether it's the complete breakdown of how country club membership fees actually flowed through an operating budget, or the detailed analysis of how local newspapers survived in pre-digital markets, or the real numbers behind what made a drive-in theater profitable despite its seasonal revenue challenges, we've created a comprehensive guide available in the description and pinned comment. It goes far beyond what we can cover in a single video, with primary source data, historical ledgers, and the kind of granular cost analysis that lets you understand not just what happened, but exactly how it happened. The institutions we explore here, the drive-in theaters, the family-owned department stores, the small-town newspapers, the country clubs, the independent gas stations, they weren't quaint artifacts of a simpler time. They were sophisticated economic operations run by people who understood their cost structures, managed their cash flow, and made strategic decisions within the constraints they faced. Some thrived for decades, some failed quickly, but all of them operated according to financial logic that we can still read, still analyze, and still learn from. That's the work I want to do on this channel, not to mourn what's lost, but to understand how it actually functioned. Not to say the past was better, but to know exactly what the trade-offs were, not to ignore the future, but to build a foundation of historical knowledge that helps us see how economies transform, what gets lost, what gets gained, and why the people living through those changes made the decisions they did. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to never miss a new deep dive into forgotten American businesses and the financial forces that shaped them. Turn on the notification bell so you're always notified when we release a new video. And if you want the full detailed guide with additional cost breakdowns and historical data, You'll find it linked in the description and in the pinned comment below. The channel's commitment is to your curiosity, so I hope to see you in the next one.